Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man tabi'al huda. Peace and blessings be upon all of you, brothers and sisters, friends, colleagues, and students. Before embarking upon the journey to understand Islam, understand the Quran, and understand the traditions, the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, it is very important that we first understand what was Arabia like, politically, economically, socially. And this will aid us in understanding the magnificence of the message of the Prophet Muhammad and the greatness of the message of Islam and the greatness of the Prophet Muhammad's work and the effects it had upon individuals, their hearts, their souls, the societies, and the nations. And it will also enable us to identify the social, economic, and political ills that were present at their time over 1400 years ago, and how they were cured and how they were changed by divine revelation from God through the message of the Prophet Muhammad. And we can look at some of the social, economic, and political ills that were present at their time and compare them and see how many of the ills that we are facing in our lives are very similar to the things we are experiencing on a daily basis here in the West and in many other countries throughout the world. So when we look and we think about and we study what was the situation in Arabia prior to Islam and look at what were the principles and techniques that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala taught the Prophet through divine revelation, in which he used to change the individual's hearts and souls and the societies that he lived in, so we can benefit from what the Prophet Muhammad did 1438 years ago and take his teachings and apply it to our lives and our societies here in the West, hopefully trying to change things for the better and develop our societies and communities. So first thing that we need to understand is the political conditions in Arabia prior to Islam. And the most remarkable feature of the political life of Arabia before Islam was the total absence of a political structure or a centralized government in any form, with the exception of Yemen in the southwest. No part of the Arabian Peninsula had any central government at any time. And the Arabs never acknowledged any authority other than the authority of their chiefs of their tribes. And the authority of the tribal chiefs, however, rested in most cases on their character and personality and was moral and ethical rather than political. And the modern student of history finds it incredible that the Arabs lived generation after generation, century after century, without a centralized form of government of any kind. And since there was no government, there was no law and order. The only law of the land was lawlessness. In the event a crime was committed, the injured party took law into its own hands and tried to administer justice to the offender. This system led very frequently to acts of horrendous cruelty, years and years of war, years and years of transgression, and years of oppression amongst many of the tribes that were there. And if the Arab ever exercised any principles of restraint, it was not because of any susceptibility he had to questions of right or wrong, but because of the fear of provoking reprisals and vendetta and revenge. And vendetta and revenge consumed many generations of the Arabs, where tribes would engage in battles and fights just to revenge something that happened to their forefathers or to their grandfathers. Since there was no such thing as police, no such thing as courts or judges. The only protection a man could find from his enemies was within his own tribe. And the tribe had an obligation to protect its members even if they had committed crimes. Tribalism, or what is known as asabiya, or bigotry, or a clan type spirit, took precedence in many times over ethics and fine morals. A tribe that failed to protect its members from their enemies exposed itself to ridicule, humiliation, and contempt. Ethics, in many cases, did not enter the picture anywhere. And since Arabia did not have a centralized government, and since the Arabs were those who could be considered anarchists by instinct, and Bedouins who were constantly moving from place to place, except for those who lived in the cities. So many times they were locked up in ceaseless warfare, and war was a permanent institution of the pre-Islamic Arabian society. And the desert could only support a limited number of people. And the state of intertribal war maintained a rigid control over the growth of population. But the Arabs themselves did not see war and battles in this light. To them, war was a pastime, or rather a dangerous sport, or a species of tribal drama waged by professionals according to old and gallant codes, while the audience cheered them on. Eternal peace held no appeal for them, and war provided an escape from drudgery and from the monotony and boredom of life in the desert. The pre-Islamic Arabs living in Arabia therefore courted the excitement of the clash of arms and battles. War gave them an opportunity to display their skills at archery, fencing, and horsemanship. And also in war, they could distinguish themselves by their heroism and at the same time win glory and honor for their tribes. In many cases, the Arabs fought for the sake of fighting, whether or not there was a cause or justification for that fighting. And many of the nomadic Bedouin tribes ranged over the Arabian Peninsula and plundered caravans and the small settlements. So anytime a caravan would pass by the areas where many of the Bedouins had their tents, they would loot and take these caravans and take all of their goods. Many caravans and villages bought immunity from these raids by paying a fixed amount of money to the nomadic freebooters. And it is important to grasp the fact that on the eve of the birth of Islam, there was no centralized government of any form in Arabia. And this fact may even have affected the rise of Islam itself. And the total absence of government, even in its most rudimentary form, was a main factor in many of the Arabs accepting the true and divine and final message of Islam that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ brought them. The population of Arabia prior to Islam consisted of two main divisions. You can say sedentary and nomadic Arabs. Hijaz and South Arabia were dotted with many small and few large towns. The rest of the country had a floating population composed of Bedouins. Many of them were backward in the civil and political sense, but they were also a source of anxiety and fear for the sedentary population. The Bedouins lived as pirates of the desert, and they were notorious for their unrestrained individualism and anarchic tribal particularism. The more important tribes exercised a certain amount of authority in their respective areas. In Mecca, the most dominant tribe was Quraysh, in which the Prophet Muhammad was a part of. In Yathrib or Medina, the dominant tribes were the Arab tribes of Aus and Khazraj, as well as the Jewish tribes of Nadir, Qaynuqa, and Qurayza. The Quraysh of Mecca considered themselves superior to the Bedouins, but the Bedouins had only contempt for the town dwellers, who for them were only a nation of shopkeepers and merchants. All Arabs in general, prior to Islam, were notorious for certain characteristics such as arrogance, conceit, boastfulness, vindictiveness, and excessive love of plunder. Their arrogance was partly responsible for much of their failure to establish a centralized government or a state of their own. They lacked political discipline, and until the rise of Islam, never acknowledged any authority as paramount in pre-Islamic Arabia. Many of them acknowledged the authority of a man who led them into a foray, but he could command their obedience only if they had an assurance of receiving a fair share of the booty during the battles. And his authority lapsed as soon as the expedition was over. And we cannot deny that the pre-Islamic Arabs practiced a large number of evils. Admittedly, vices and evils utterly rejected by reason were widespread among the pre-Islamic Arabs, but this could never screen off the surprising existence of highly praiseworthy virtues. From amongst them, hospitality. The pre-Islamic Arabs, they used to compete with each other in hospitality and take utmost pride in it. Almost half of all their poetry was about the praiseworthy or improper manners of entertaining one's guests. A guest would visit a man suffering from severe cold and hunger, the host having no wealth besides a she-camel upon whom the lives of his entire family depended, so he would slaughter it to feed his guest. And the pre-Islamic Arabs, they would not hesitate to incur heavy blood money and relevant burdens just to stop bloodshed and consequently merit praise and eulogy. Among their foremost qualities was their praise of wine, of the consumption of intoxicants and drinking alcohol and wine, not because it was worth boasting of by itself, but because it was a means of displaying hospitality and pampering the soil. For such reasons, the grapevine itself was called karm, the same word used for honor, and wine was called the daughter of karm. And when looking at the collection of odes and poems of the pre-Islamic period, one discovers it full of chapters upon chapters of praise and boasting. Another thing that was common amongst the Arabs is gambling. Gambling was also another practice of theirs closely associated with generosity, since the proceeds would always go to charity. Also, the Arabs, the pre-Islamic Arabs, were known for keeping their covenants. For the Arabs, to make a promise was to run into debt. He would never care for the death of his children or destruction of his household, all for the sake of upholding the deep-rooted tradition of covenant keeping. And the literature of that period is rich in stories highlighting this merit. Also, the pre-Islamic Arabs' sense of honor and denial of injustice. This attribute developed mainly from excess of courage and a keen sense of self-esteem. The Arab was always in revolt against the slightest hint to humiliation or disregard. He would never hesitate to sacrifice himself to maintain his ever-alert sense of self-respect. Also, the pre-Islamic Arabs were known for their firm will and determination. And an Arab would never lose an opportunity contributing to an object of pride or a standing of honor, even if it were at the expense of his own life. Also, the pre-Islamic Arabs were known for their forbearance and perseverance and mildness, and the Arabs regarded these qualities with great admiration. And no wonder his impulsiveness and courage-based life was sadly in need of them. And lastly, but certainly not leastly, the pure and simple Bedouin life that was still clean from the accessories of deceptive urban appearances and was a driving reason behind his nature of truthfulness and honesty and detachment from intrigue and treachery. And such priceless ethics, coupled with a favorable geographical position of Arabia, were the factors that lay behind the selecting the Arabs to undertake the burden of communicating the message of Islam and leading mankind down a new course in life. So now let's turn and look and talk and discuss what were the economic conditions of Arabia. Economically, the Arabs, they were either farmers, merchants, or shepherds. Remember now, in the city of Yathrib, there were many Jews. And the Jews, in one sense, they were somewhat some of the economic leaders of Arabia. They were the owners of the arable lands in Hijaz, in which they used for farming and in which they irrigated. They were also entrepreneurs of such industries as existed in Arabia in those days, and they enjoyed a monopoly of the armaments industry and producing of weapons. Also, slavery was an economic institution that was present in Arabia as well. It was present amongst the Arabs. So male and female slaves were sold and bought like animals, and they formed the most depressed class of the Arabian society. And the most powerful class of the Arabs were made up by the capitalists and the money lenders. The rates of interest which they charged on loans was exorbitant and were especially designed to make the rich richer and the borrowers poorer and poorer. And the most important urban centers of Arabia were two, Mecca and Yathrib or Medina, both in Hijaz. The citizens of Mecca, they were mostly merchants, traders, and moneylenders. And their caravans traveled in the summer to the north, to Syria, and in the winter to the south and Yemen. They also traveled to the east, to Bahrain, and to the northeast to Iraq. And the caravan trade was basic to the economy of Mecca, and its organization called for considerable skill, experience, and ability. And the arrivals and departures of caravans were important events in the lives of the Meccans. Almost everyone in Mecca had some kind of investment in the fortunes of those thousands of camels, the hundreds of men, horses, and donkeys which went out with animal hides, raisins, silver bars, and then came back with perfumes, oils, and manufactured goods from Syria, from Egypt, from Persia, and with spices and gold from the south towards Yemen. In Medina or Yathrib, the Arabs mostly made their living by farming. And the Jews, they were farmers as well. They were businessmen as well as industrialists. But the Jews were not exclusively businessmen and industrialists. They were also farmers, and they were known for bringing much of the waste land or desert land and irrigating it and bringing it under cultivation. So economically, socially, and politically, Hijaz was the most important province in Arabia in the early 7th century Common Era. So on the eve of Islam, the most complex and advanced human aggregate of the Arabian Peninsula lived in the city of the Quraysh tribe. The hour of the South Arab kingdoms of Petra and Palmyra had passed for some time in the history of Arabia. Now the future was being prepared there in Hijaz, in Mecca, and in Medina. And the Arabs and the Jews, both of them practiced usury. They were both lenders. Many of them were actually professional usurers. They lived on the interest they charged on their loans. And usury or riba was widely practiced in Mecca. For in order to participate in the profitable caravan trade, many times the residents of Mecca or those merchants in Mecca had only a modest income, and they had to resort to the loaners or the usurers, despite the high interest. He could hope to benefit after the safe return of the caravan, and the richer merchants were both traders and usurers at the same time. Money lenders usually took a dinar for a dinar, or as you could say, $1 for $1, meaning 100% interest. And This could mean that interest sometimes could even be 200 or 400%. And the net profits of Meccan businessmen and those specifically who were dealing with usury caught not only fellow citizens and tribesmen but also members of the Bedouin tribes that lived within Hijaz who were also active in the Meccan trades. So what were the social conditions in Arabia? Arabia prior to Islam was a male-dominated society. Women had no status of any kind other than being used as sexual objects and servants. The number of women a man could marry was not fixed. When a man died, his son inherited all his wives except his own mother. Also, a very common custom amongst some of the Arabs was to bury their female infants alive. Even if an Arab did not wish to bury his daughter alive, many still had to uphold this honorable tradition, being unable to resist the social pressures around him. Also, drunkenness was a common vice amongst the pre-Islamic Arabs, and drunkenness went along with their gambling. They were compulsive drinkers and compulsive gamblers, and the relations, between male and female were very loose. Many women sold themselves as prostitutes to make their living since there was nothing else that they could do to earn a living. And these women, the prostitutes, they flew flags on their houses and were called the ladies of the flags or that al-rayat, right? Imam al-Bukhari, he mentions this in his compilation of some of the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, and he also mentions some of the types of marriage that were common before Islam. And there were 4 types of marriage that were common prior to Islam. And when the Prophet Muhammad came with the divine revelation from Allah, he eliminated these types of marriage except the type which was present in pre-Islamic time and is still present today, the type of marriage in which a man proposes to a woman and then he offers her a dower to take her hand in marriage. So this type, which was present before Islamic times, is also still present today. As for the other types of marriage, then Islam has eliminated the other pre-Islamic types of marriage. The other type of marriage that was present prior to Islam is a man would say to his wife when she was purified from her menses, he would say to another man to go have sexual intercourse with my wife. He would tell the man to go have sexual intercourse with his wife, and then her husband would stay away from her and not touch her until it is clear that she is pregnant or not. And when it is clear that she is pregnant, her husband then has intercourse with her if he wants to. And he acts thus simply from the desire of having a child. And this type of marriage was known as, you could say, nikah al-istibdal, or the marriage of seeking intercourse. Another type of marriage that was present prior to Islam is when a group of men less than 10 used to visit the same woman, and all of them would have intercourse with her. And if she became pregnant and bore a child, then after having the child, she would choose the father of the child. And the last type is similar to this, is that there would be many different men that would frequent a woman, and she does not keep herself from anyone who comes to have intimacy and sexual relations with her. And these women were known as what we see in our society as prostitutes. So they used to set up, as we said, flags on their doors, and whoever wanted them went into them. And if one of them had a child, they gathered together and they would choose the father. And the father, whoever was chosen to be the father, even though if it wasn't his son, he could not object to taking that child under his care and under his maintenance. So as we said, Islam eliminated all those types of marriages except for the first one, in which the male proposes to the woman accepts, and there is a dowry between them along with witnesses. So what was the state of religion? What were the people following in regards to the religions that they were practicing in pre-Islamic Arabia? The period in the Arabian history which preceded the birth of Islam is known as al-Jahiliyyah, is known as the times of ignorance. And judging by the beliefs and the practices of the pagan Arabs, it appears that it was most appropriate term and a name for that period of time. The Arabs were the devotees of a variety of religions, which can be classified into many categories. From amongst the Arabs, the pre-Islamic Arabs, there were those who worshipped idols and were considered polytheists. And many of them, most of them were idolaters. They worshipped numerous idols, and each tribe had its own idol or its own tribal fetishes. They had turned the Kaaba in Mecca, which had been built by the Prophet Abraham and his son Ismail, and was dedicated by them to the service of God. They turned the Kaaba in Mecca into a heathen pantheon housing over 360 idols of stone and wood. Also, prior to the advent of the Prophet Muhammad, there were atheists who were present. And they were composed of materialists and believed that the world was eternal and that there was no afterlife. Also, there were those who can be considered or called zindiqs, heretics. And those were individuals who were influenced by the Persian doctrine of dualism in nature. They believed that there were two gods representing the twin forces of good and evil, or light and darkness, and both were locked up in an unending struggle for supremacy in the universe. Then there were the Sabi'in, those who worshiped the stars and the planets. Also, there were Jews, as we mentioned, Jews who were in Medina. So when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in the year about 70 Common Era and drove the Jews out of Palestine in Syria, many of them found new homes in Hijaz, in Arabia, and specifically in Yathrib, in Medina, and Khaybar and Fadak. Also, there were Christians. There were Christians who were also present in Arabia as well. Many of the Romans had converted the North Arabian tribes of Ghassan to Christianity. Some clans of Ghassan had migrated to and had settled in Hijaz, in Mecca and Medina, and in the south there were many Christians in Yemen, where the creed was originally brought by where? By the Ethiopian invaders across the ocean from Africa. And their strong center was the town of Najran. And also, there were monotheists. There were monotheists who were still upon the religion of Abraham and his son Ismail. So there was a small group of monotheists present in Arabia on the eve of the rise of Islam. Its members did not worship idols, and they were followers of the Prophet Abraham. The members of the families of the Prophet Muhammad and most members of their clan, Banu Hashim, belonged to this group. So what was education like? What was education like amongst the Arabs in Arabia prior to Islam? Among the Arabs, there were extremely few individuals who could read and write. Most of them were not very eager to learn these arts as well. And some historians are of the opinion that the culture of the period was entirely oral. And those who knew how to write, the majority of them were Jews and Christians who were living in the Arab lands. And the greatest intellectual accomplishment of the Arabs was their poetry. They claimed that Allah, the creator of the universe, had bestowed the most remarkable qualities of the head and the brain upon the Greeks. And its proof is in their science and philosophy. And Allah had given, right, and bestowed his favors of the hand upon the Chinese. And the proof of that is in their craftsmanship. And Allah had bestowed the blessings of being able to speak and being eloquent with the tongue upon the Arabs. And it's proved by their eloquence. And the Arabs' greatest pride, before Islam and after Islam, and still is, was their eloquence and their poetry and their ability to be great speakers. And the importance of poetry to the Arabs can be gauged by looking at their golden odes, their poetry, and many of what the Arab poets said prior to Islam. And in pre-Islamic Arabia, the poets were considered even to be part of the equipment that they would use, or those individuals that they would need to go out and engage in battles and wars, because those reciting the poetry would give courage, would increase the bravery and increase the strength and power and mental strength of those soldiers and those warriors who were engaging in battle. And most of the information that we have about social affairs, the morals of the Arabs, the ethics of the Arabs, and the education of the Arabs can be found in the Arabic pre-Islamic poetry, which was known for its photographic faithfulness to all phases of Arabian tribal life and its environment. Specialists and those who study the Arabic language accept this poetry as the most important and authoritative source for describing the Arab people and their customs in this period. And Arabic poetry is rich in its eloquence, and it was nevertheless a faithful mirror of life in ancient Arabia. Also, in cultivating the art of poetry, the Arab poets were unconsciously developing one of the greatest artifacts of mankind, the Arabic language. And the greatest compositions of the pre-Islamic Arabs were called the Golden Odes. And these were a collection of 7 poems, or they call them the Mu'allaqat. And they were supposedly unsurpassed in their excellence and spontaneity, their power and their eloquence. And they used to be hung on the Kaaba as a challenge to any aspiring genius or any eloquent Arab to come to match them or to excel their linguistic value and their linguistic eloquence and excellence. So they were hung on the Kaaba. These poems were hung on the Kaaba, and anybody who came either to do worship at the Kaaba or to trade with some of the merchants in Mecca, they would see these poems, they would read them, they would memorize them, and then they would go back to their country and recite these poems to their tribesmen. So with the rise of Islam, the emphasis shifted temporarily from poetry to prose, and poetry lost its prestigious position as the queen of the arts of Arabia. And the greatest composition of Islam is the Quran, the last book of revelation that was revealed to the final prophet Muhammad. May peace and blessings be upon him and all of the messengers that Allah sent to mankind. So the Quran was the greatest composition and is the greatest composition of Islam, and it was in prose. And the Quran is composed and was written in the heavens, in the skies, in the preserved tablet, preserved with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala before it was revealed to the sky, and then before it was revealed from the sky to the Prophet Muhammad, the final messenger of Allah. And no human genius can ever produce anything that can match the Quran's style, the Quran's eloquence, or the Quran's contents. For generations after generations, it has been, for Muslims as well as non-Muslims, a model of literary, philosophical, theological, legal, metaphysical, and spiritual thought. So Arabia before Islam was without social amenity or historical depth, and the pre-Islamic Arabs lived in moral bankruptcy and spiritual servitude. Life for them was devoid of meaning, purpose, and direction. as we see many of those who live around us here in the West. They don't know what is their purpose in life. Their life has no meaning except for fulfilling their physical and base desires, similar to the Arabs. And the human spirit was in chains and was awaiting, as it were, a signal to make a titanic struggle, to break loose and to become free. And this signal that was given to the Arabs was the sending of the noble Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the year 610 Common Era, in the city of Mecca, in Arabia, in Hijaz, when he proclaimed his mission of prophethood and launched the greatest movement of reformation called Islam and set it on its world-girdling career. Islam was the greatest blessing for mankind ever. It set men and women free through obedience to their Creator. It freed men and women from slavery in all of its manifestations. People now were becoming spiritually free and worshiping the Creator and not worshiping the creation. So Muhammad, the messenger of Allah, was the supreme emancipator of mankind. He extricated man from all the pits and all the downfalls in life. And the Arabian Peninsula was geographically peripheral and politically terra incognito until the early 7th century Common Era. It was then that the Prophet Muhammad put the Arabian Peninsula on the political map, the economic map, the social map of the world by making it the theater of momentous events of history. And before Islam, the Arabs had played only a marginal role in the history of the Middle East, and they would have remained forever a nation of animists and shepherds if it wasn't for the Prophet Muhammad, and it wasn't for the Prophet Muhammad providing them divine guidance from Allah and giving them focus and being the stimulus that welded their scattered nomadic tribes into a purposeful driving force. The Prophet Muhammad molded a nation out of rough mass without basic structure. He invested the Arabs with a new dynamism, idealism, and explosive creativity, and they changed the course of history for years to come. He created an entirely new mental and psychological ecology, and the Prophet Muhammad Muhammad's work placed an emphatic period in world history. It was the end of one era and the beginning of another. So, we're discussing this today as an introduction to the study of Islam and also the study of the noble Quran. So the students who are going to embark upon studying the Quran and the sciences of the Quran and the meanings of the Quran, they should have this knowledge and understanding of the economic, the political, the social, and the religious situations that existed in Arabia prior to the sending of the Prophet Muhammad. And then once you embark on the journey of understanding the Quran, then you will come to understand many of the concepts and themes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mentioning in the Quran. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to guide us all and to bless us and to give us correct and proper knowledge of the Quran and of the Sunnah and of Islam. Jazakallah khair wa barakallahu feek. Subhanaka Allahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.